So this talk is called Arguing with People That Believe in Einstein's Relativity, Part 2. I have been to a physics conference and pointed out 3 problems with special relativity. Those there who believed in Einstein's relativity, who I would call the believers, leapt to its defence. I want to go through the 3 problems I presented and their responses. The 3 problems were Lorentz transformation do not reduce to Galilean transformations at low speed, and that's contrary to what is taught. 2, there are relativity physicists now saying there is no relativistic mass, and that's contrary to what is taught as well. And 3, when Einstein speaks of stationary system, it seems that is what others would call ether frame. So you get the information that Lorentz transformations do not reduce to Galilean transformations at low speeds from this paper. It's called 2 Myths About Special Relativity by a person called Rolf. The problem is time. The Lorentz transformation has this equation for time, and the Galilean transformation for time is t prime is equal to t. And I'm just going to assume these equations are familiar to everyone. The problem is with the Lorentz transformation for time. For low speed, the gamma factor approximately equals 1, and so t prime approximately equals to t minus vx divided by c squared. And the trick being used to think as v tends to 0, then the term vx divided by c squared tends to 0, and so you end up with just t, and that then gives you the Galilean transformation for time, and that's what was being taught. But that's not what happens, because as v tends to 0 can make x of the x divided by c squared arbitrarily large. So what's being taught is false, and the term does not disappear. If you disagree with this maths, then you need to read Rolf's paper, because he's pointing out what we've been taught is false. I think those in the audience eventually agreed with what was being said by Rolf and dismissed it as special relativity being badly taught, and that special relativity was right regardless. That, in my view, is moving the goalpost, and by moving goalpost you mean an informal fallacy in which evidence presented in response to a specific claim is dismissed and some other, often greater evidence is demanded. That is, after an attempt has been made to score a goal, the goalposts are moved to exclude the attempt. I pointed out that what's being taught was false, and now they want to claim that was not really relativity. And it's worth noting, as you go into the other responses, I shall point out that it's all moving goalposts as well. So what's being taught is false. You point out to them what's being taught is false, and that doesn't stop them believing relativity. They just decide to believe the textbooks are not explaining themselves properly, and that is moving the goalposts. On the second issue of relativistic mass, there are relativity physicists now saying there's no relativistic mass, and this was pointed out in David de Hilse's film, which is called Einstein Wrong. But physicists like Don Lincoln are now saying there is no relativistic mass, and that is contrary to what is taught to physics students. And the video clip I showed was from that video link. Pointing out that relativistic mass is being taught, but there are people saying there's no relativistic mass, caused the believers to stop arguing against me and instead argue among themselves. I think some believed in relativistic mass and others didn't believe in relativistic mass, and lots of other variations. I think after they stopped arguing among themselves, the decision was that whether relativistic mass existed or not, it was still relativity, special relativity. However, I'm not fully sure what their decision was. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is more goalpost moving. Certain things are said about special relativity, and the believers then want to change things and say something else, and still pretend after the changes that it is still relativity. The third problem with special relativity was based on my talk to the John Chappell Natural Philosophy Society. And thing to note is ether can be spelt two ways. And where I was pointing out that with a bit of manipulation in the math that Einstein presented in his 1905 special relativity paper could end up with what seemed an ether frame, and that seemed contrary to what Einstein said about getting rid of ether in that paper. I went on to point out that when Einstein talked to a stationary frame in his 1905 special relativity paper, that just seemed to be a renaming of the ether frame, i.e. Einstein didn't really seem to get rid of ether, he just changed its name, and that's also something not taught. And the believers, I think, just dismissed that as philosophical interpretation. I think their point of view was that you can interpret things in different ways, so they're just dismissing that. The believers then went on to point out that GPS could not work unless Einstein's relativity was correct. I then pointed out about the GPS engineer Ron Hatz, who's well known to us at Japan Natural Philosophy Society, and he disagrees with what they're saying about that. Finally, the believers said that Einstein's relativity was correct because all experiments agree with it, thus implying on me an onus to give an experiment to disprove Einstein's relativity. In my view, that was a deliberate misunderstanding of my talk. I was pointing out that what was being taught about special relativity was false, and I gave 3 examples, and their method of then claiming special relativity was something other than that was taught was bogus. It was flawed thinking on their part and the fallacy of moving goalposts. Showing the theory as taught is wrong then should mean they need a different theory, but they don't seem to accept that, and all they do is move goalposts. As we dissidents kick the ball and attempt to score a goal which represents a goal against Einstein's relativity, showing it's wrong, what they do is move the goalposts, which represents they keep changing what the theory is supposed to be and pretend it's something else. So I've worked out the following flow chart to explain what is happening. Going through the steps now to build this flow chart. So what that happens is the experimenters say experiments support special relativity, and there is of course arguing over the experiment. experiments, but eventually the experiments which they say support special relativity are the ones they sort of accept, and those that seem to lead special relativity as being wrong, they sort of tend to ignore or suppress. Now, what experimenters say special relativity is, I'm going to call SR star, and the reason why it's called SR star will become more apparent later on. So experimenters say experiments support SR star. However, these experimenters don't go into sufficient detail to explain SR star, so that creates the next step in the flowchart. It raises the question, what is special relativity, i.e. SR? So then we have to look for who is going to tell us what special relativity is, which is going to be the physics education system, the educators. So as you go down, we've raised the question of what is special relativity. The educators teach special relativity. That's what they claim, but I'm going to label what educators teach as SR star star. So that's our flow chart. Experimenters say experiments support SR star. Raise your question, what is special relativity? Educators teach SR star star. And the reason why educators teach SR star star instead of SR star is because educators make false claims that are unsupported by experiments. The educator will say their claims are supported by experiments, but that will most of the time just be a false claim. So what they're teaching is SR star star. And SR star star is not the same as SR star, i.e. what the experimenters think is special relativity is not the same as what the education establishment think it is. SR star star and SR star are not the same thing. That means at the step in the flowchart where the question is raised, what is special relativity, there has been a communication breakdown, and that's between the experimenters and the educators. That allows the believers in special relativity to keep moving the goalpost. No goal against Einstein's relativity will be allowed, because the goalpost will be forever moved out of the way of the ball by the method that the physics community has set up, namely the method of communication breakdown between experimenters and educators. And that's the end of this little talk, and that's my conclusion from when I gave a talk to believers in special relativity and general relativity. What they do is form excuses so that they can move the goalposts. They don't accept what is being told to them about myths and misconceptions being taught in special relativity. They just pretend that special relativity is something else when things like that are pointed out to them.